Hello and good evening. My name is Crystal Parikh. I'm the director of the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today to the first event for our spring semester, celebrating Helen Zia's latest publication, Last Boat Out of Shanghai. Tonight's event continues with our year-long focus at the Institute on migration, refugees, and the politics of sanctuary. I'd like to thank the staff at the APA Institute for all their work in organizing tonight's event. And I'd encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, which you can do on the APA Institute's website or at the check-in right when you walked in the door there. Also, please be sure to follow us on social media. I'd also like to take a moment to have us recognize that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. New York City is currently home to approximately 100,000 people who identify as indigenous, including many peoples from the Pacific. We at the Institute affirm our commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. As we begin tonight's event, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of the program format. We will begin with a reading from the author, Helen Zia, followed by comments from our panelists, who I will introduce a little later in the evening, and then conversation with the audience. There will be a reception after the event, and there are books for sale by the NYU bookstore, and Helen will be signing books, I believe, yes. Thank you for that as well. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Helen Zia, who we are so pleased to welcome Helen, who was a writer-in-residence in 2004 to 2005 at the Institute, back to NYU. She's an activist, author, and former journalist. In 2000, her first book, Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People, was a finalist for the prestigious Kiriyama Pacific Rim Book Prize. Her groundbreaking articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in many publications, books, and anthologies, receiving numerous awards. Zia has received an honorary Doctor of Laws degrees from the Law School of the City University of New York for bringing important matters of law and civil rights into public view. She is a Fulbright scholar and a graduate of Princeton University's first co-educational class. We'll be hearing from her latest book, as I mentioned, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution, which is just hot off the presses with Ballantine Books this year.
Wow, let me take this in for a moment. I have to say, I know that there are other writers and artists in this room, and you know, I've been in a cave practically for 12 years. This book has been in the process for a long time. There are some people, like my former editor-in-chief at Ms. Magazine, Robin Morgan, who was in on this from the very beginning, helped write a recommendation for me to do get a Fulbright grant to actually do some of this research. And Robin, thank you so much for that. There are others here, dear friends I see all over, childhood friends who I haven't seen for many years. And Stella Dong, who had helped me so much even before my Fulbright to put me in touch with people she had known from her book on Shanghai. And just so many of you here, dear friends and new friends. So thank you very much. There's nothing more heartwarming for a writer than to, you know, have this thing, and it's been a 12-year gestation period to birth this book, and then to see that people actually are interested enough to read it and to come out on a night like this to hear something about the book. So thank you very much. And because time is short, and I really do want to give as much time as possible for discussion and for questions that you might have, I want to talk just a little bit about the book and maybe read parts from it. And then we have these amazing, brilliant scholars who are going to interrogate me. And so maybe I should talk a lot and only give them like a tiny amount of time. So some of you were here long enough to see the slides that I had put together, because in these 12 years, I've really been immersing myself in what it was like in Shanghai in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, what led up to a mass exodus that has actually been forgotten and really never reported on. except at the time when people were saying, well, where are all these people from Shanghai coming? Why are they invading Hong Kong and Taiwan, ending up in Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia or Brazil, and the very tiny number that were permitted in the US, none allowed in Australia because they still had the whites-only policy, and Europe was still, recovering from World War II. So there was, an exodus that was forgotten. And this exodus out of China involved millions of people, actually unknown how many, and out of Shanghai, a city of 6 million, and I want to ask, how many of you have ever been to Shanghai? Quite a few of you. So you know about Shanghai, and those who don't, Shanghai in the 1930s and the 1940s was one of the very few top cities of the world. It ranked with London, New York, Paris, Berlin of the time. And so the most famous scholars of the world, Albert Einstein, noted people like Charles Bernard Shaw, Charlie Chaplin, W.H. Auden, the list could go on, ended up stopping in Shanghai because that was the place to be. And so what would lead a city like Shanghai or New York, for example, where people identify so much with their city, they love their city, it's their home, their intellectual life, their social networks, their extended families. What would lead you to suddenly get up and leave? And so that's what I started wondering about in why I began this book. The notion that there is a last boat out of Shanghai. This was all I knew when I was a child, that my mother and my aunt would say, oh, we left Shanghai on the last boat. Now, as a kid, that didn't mean a lot to me. It's like, oh, it was the last one scheduled, okay. But as I got older, I met so many other people who were from Shanghai or in the area and through Shanghai because it was an international city. If you were going out of the country, chances are from all parts of China, you would be getting through Shanghai, unless you were right at the border of Guangzhou in Guangdong province. So the more people I met, the more I learned that they too had relatives who had left on the last boat out of Shanghai. And the more you heard, it was, they couldn't all possibly have been on that boat. There are thousands of them. And what was it? The Ark? And then not only that, they would talk about the last plane or the last train. And it was very clear that there was such a sense of panic, that they had to be on out, and they might be on the very last boat out. So that's all I knew, and I was curious about that. And actually, the former founding director of the APA Institute here, Jack Chen, was also part of that diaspora, and he and I would joke, oh, you were also on the proverbial last boat out of Shanghai, how about that? And there came a time, though, my curiosity was sparked by something else. I heard a story, and some of you might already know this story, but I'm going to read part of it from my book. I spent 12 years doing research on this period, historic research, archival research, and also searching for anybody I could who was also part of this diaspora, this exodus. And because it was not recorded, it really began by word of mouth. I mean, I think there are a number of you here who I asked, do you know anybody who was part of this Shanghai diaspora, this Shanghai exodus, who might have lived in Shanghai, who has relatives who are part of this time in the 1940s? And so I had interviewed more than 100 people as preliminary oral histories about them. And then when it came time to actually start thinking of a book and how it would be structured, it was having to find some stories. And there was one story that really sparked everything, and I just want to read part of it. It was one of the 4 characters I have. It's a nonfiction book, so I call them characters, but they are all real people. These are their real experiences, their real names. And so this character was one of the girls, 2 girls and 2 boys, that I track from actually the beginning of of World War II in China, the Sino-Japanese War, with the invasion of Shanghai, the Battle of Shanghai that really marked the first major battle of Japan's aggression in China. And so this starts with a little girl who is in the outskirts of Shanghai, and she's about to go on a trip with her father, who she calls Baba, and the only name she had at that time was Little Sister, which you know in Chinese would be Meme. Baba announced that he would take Little Sister on a train to Suzhou, 60 miles away toward Shanghai. She remembered every moment of that journey, for she had been giddy that Baba had chosen her, not one of her brothers. She sat on her father's lap, her eyes glued to the window, mesmerized by the neat rice fields and towns, just like hers, sweeping by in a blur. When they arrived in Suzhou, she saw men and women dressed in fine silk fabrics and even foreign outfits, unlike her mother and father, who wore roughly woven traditional wear. Big posters showed pretty ladies with curly black hair wearing tight cheepaos, promoting cigarettes, mosquito coils, and rat poison. When they left the train station, Baba flagged down the driver of a wooden moon-wheeled cart. After a twisty, bumpy ride over arched stone bridges and canals lined by weeping willows, they finally came to a stop at a small store. Inside, her father spoke to the shopkeepers in a low voice, while she stood waiting by the door, looking at the parade of vendors and hawkers on the street. There was so much more to see there than in her town. Soon Baba called for her and told her to stand still beside him. The shopkeepers looked into her mouth and squeezed her thin arms. When they were finished poking and prodding her, one of them took her hand and led her to another room. As she turned to look for her father, she saw his back as he headed toward the door. "Baba, Baba," she had cried after him. He didn't turn around. "Baba, come back," she cried. How could he leave without her? The stranger gently pushed her into a small, dank storeroom and locked the door. Alone and terrified of what might lurk in the darkness, at first she could only whimper. Then she steeled herself and called for her father as hard as she could until she grew hoarse and couldn't shout anymore. Exhausted, she sobbed herself to sleep. When the little girl awakened on the musty dirt floor, she thought she had had a terrible nightmare. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. She could see the glare of daylight around the cracks. Once again, she screamed for her father. Baba never came. So I first heard this story when I was in my 50s, and I had already been thinking about the last boat out of Shanghai and what did that mean. And I heard this story, and I was in my 50s, and the teller was in her mid to late 70s. And that was my mother who told me that story. And so all my growing up, I had never known anything about my mother's life because I would say to her, like a kid would, "Mom, can you tell me something about your life growing up as a child?" And she would say, "Oh, that was wartime, unhappy memory." And that would be it. And anybody who's been through war or catastrophe or trauma, they know. You stop asking because that was something painful. And so over time for me as a kid growing up, I thought there was nothing more to say until I was in my 50s having dinner with my mother, and she was in her 70s, and I somehow babbled my childhood mantra and just said, "Oh, Mom, too bad you can't tell me anything about when you were growing up." And she stopped and said, "Okay, you want to know? I'll tell you." And I was in a state of shock. I was silent. I didn't say another word and just listened to my mother as this story came out. And this was a story that just haunted me, of course. And I listened. I didn't want to interrupt my mother because I thought it would stop her sharing something that she had not told a soul for more than 70 years. It was a shameful secret to her. It was a stigma of having been abandoned and then having to find a life of what do you do? You know, she knew she was given away because her family at the time that the war was just beginning, China was so impoverished that families could no longer, they had to decide, who do we feed with the little food we have and who do we starve? And so my mother knew, she said, I was given away because I was a girl. And that was something very painful for her all her life. And until she revealed it to me, she hadn't told anybody. And so I listened, and I have to say with a little bit of embarrassment when she finally paused and kind of looked at me as though she was trying to feel the thin ice she had been stepping on, all I could think of to say was, wow, Mom, you have a good memory. And how profound a response to what she was sharing with me. And she replied, I was 6 years old. I remember everything. It was the worst day of my life. And so from there, I just learned that so many other things happen to a child who at 6 years old is abandoned, wondering what happened to Baba and my mother and my two brothers. And so she proceeded to tell me this. I asked her, can I share this with my brothers and my sister? And she cautiously nodded, and slowly she began to share more of it and allow more people to know, the grandchildren and so forth. And with each telling, I could really feel the pain that had wrapped around those secrets began to kind of move a little bit away so that she could begin to heal from something that she had never told anybody. And over time, I began to say, do you mind if I take notes? Can I stick this recorder here? Do you mind if I put a video camera up? And I started asking my mother to tell me everything. And there was a lot because she really did remember everything. And then as somebody who cares about, you know, what's going on in the world and what did this mean about my mother and how did she, as a child who was abandoned when she was 6, you know, in 1936, at the start of the Japanese invasion, the 8 years of war and occupation, living through that, and then you know, even before the ink was dried when Japan surrendered, the civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists went full bloom, and so there was more war, more suffering, more starvation, more death all around. More children growing up in Shanghai at that time knew that they knew if you see a dead body on the street, just walk around it or go to the other side. There were so many of people who had passed away the night before, little babies, and people who were near death all around. And that was the kind of thing, the climate, some of the photos here, I showed some of that in Shanghai. And that's what my mother grew up in. And I began to wonder, so what was that like for other people too? Was my mother an exception? Was this, you know, how did children like my mother and others survive this time? What did they experience? How did they experience? And, you know, I knew when I learned this about my mother, it just made me see her world, and we all have that mythology we grow up with in our families about this is where I came from, this is how it's constructed, this is my family mythology. And that just turned all of that around and made me see my mother as, you know, not as a victim, which was her shame in thinking about herself, but as somebody who was incredibly strong and resilient, who had gone through things that you wonder if that had happened to me or anybody I know, how could we have gone through not just this, but the many other things that happened to her. And then, as I discovered, the 100 other people who had lived through this time, and every one of them had the most shocking, the most dramatic, the most inspiring stories that you can ever imagine. And so I began to think of how do I tell a story that also shows the history behind what was going on. So one of the things that became clear to me was also that, and I try to show this in great detail in this last Boat Out of Shanghai, of the 4 people that I interviewed, and I tried to kind of subversively add as many other people as I could into this book and their stories. One thing that was very clear is that people spent months and months, and in some cases years, trying to decide, should I leave or should I stay? Would it be safer for me to stay in Shanghai? I survived 8 years of war and occupation. I survived the collapse of a government, the complete collapse of the economy in Shanghai, the terrible things that happen. We see the news today and what's happening in places like Venezuela. That was going on in Shanghai too. So they're like, I survived that. What could be worse? A revolution? Should I leave? Should I stay? And in Shanghai, many of you have been there, it was not only a world-class city, but of those 6 million, it was the most modern city, the most westernized city, the most industrialized city. It was really the most of everything in China. It had a huge gap between rich and poor, and there were many rich people and also a very large middle class. It had the top intellectuals of China, sort of every language you can imagine was spoken there. Newspapers in every language were there. It was not hard for me to find many documents in English. And had I spoken Danish, Russian, German, Portuguese, French, all of those newspapers were there. And of course, many, many records and newspapers in Chinese as well. And so it was a city of great intellectual, vigor and people of all classes and all walks of life. And because it also had the wealthy class and the middle class, they knew what a communist revolution meant. Now, most of them had never really met a communist that they knew of, because Shanghai had been under martial law under the Japanese, and then it was under martial law under the Nationalists, and anybody who had one iota of disagreement or resistance or criticism of the government would be accused of being a communist and potentially shot on the spot, right in the street. And there were many street executions that happened, especially as the revolution happened. So what was going on is that the old regime, the Nationalists, spread incredible fear among the people too of what would happen if the communists came, how you would suffer that way. So beginning in about 1947, people started thinking, it doesn't look like this government's going to make it. It doesn't deserve to make it. The corruption that was there, the inability to feed people anymore. And people began thinking, you know what, I got to start hedging my bet. And so anyone with resources to send somewhere else, and those resources might have included their firstborn son, some of their children, if they were of the capitalist industrialist class and had capital or machinery, they were sending it elsewhere because they were thinking, if this revolution happens, it's going to be a problem. And we want to make sure some of our kids, my firstborn son, we will send away and make sure our family name continues somewhere. So this began in about 1947. Then everybody else was thinking, well, I don't have money, I'm not rich. If I can only afford to buy 3 tickets, and I have a large extended family and many children, who gets to go? And so these were the kind of debates people were happening. If we stay, will we survive? Will my kids live? Will anybody be here? Can we make it in Shanghai if there's a revolution? But if we leave, we could die. Where would we go? How would we live? And so these were the kind of discussions that every one of the people I interviewed was part of. Their families, it was just a debate. And there were newspaper stories that said the entire city is engaged. There's only one question, one topic on the mind of people in Shanghai. Do you stay or do you flee? So as the Red Army, the People's Liberation Army, began to press forward, and they were able to, it was pretty clear that they were going to reach, the Changjiang, the Yangtze River. And if they did that, they would get Shanghai. And Shanghai was not only the Pearl of the Orient, the Paris of the Orient, it was also the gem that any governmental force, if they had Shanghai, they had the country. And so as it approached, all hell broke loose. And it would be as though, New York City, which was about the same size, slightly larger than Shanghai, suddenly got gripped by a total fear, and everybody decided that we're not going to make it through this. We better go, and go at the same time. And so there wouldn't be enough boats, there wouldn't be enough exits, there wouldn't be enough planes that could take everybody. And people actually ended up running to the docks and trampling each other in order to see if they could, maybe fling themselves onto a boat. So this was one of the things that happened. And I wanted to make it especially clear some of the lessons that I learned from this, which was, number one, as I did not plan for this book 12 years when I started it to be published at a time when immigrants and refugees around the world are facing, so much hatred and xenophobia, not just here in this country, but all around the world. The UN says that there are 68+ million refugees around the world at this time, and that number continues to grow. And we hear every day in the headlines just how unwelcome these people, these refugees, these human beings are, and their babies, and that they are going to bring the demise of this country. Well, one of the things is in tracking this 70-year-old exodus is that the same things were said about the refugees and migrants and exiles of that time in World War II, from Shanghai, the ones who ended up anywhere they went. They were considered to be possibly communist infiltrators, just not welcome, closing down the borders. And that was not only true for the Chinese or the Shanghainese. Shanghai had about 20,000 Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe who were fleeing the Nazis of World War II. They ended up in Shanghai. Why? Because the ships they were on were not permitted to land in the United States anywhere. They were not permitted to land in the United Kingdom anywhere. And the only port in the world that would accept them was Shanghai. And that was the port of last resort, and they ended up in Shanghai. So here, people fleeing the Holocaust were not welcome. Well, these Chinese who fled were also facing, if they managed to land here, and in New York, one of my characters, Ho Chow, became a stranded student in New York City. And so what happens when you're on a student visa? Here we are at NYU. And by the way, he also then became a student at NYU. What happens, you're on a student visa, I'm sure some of you know. You're not allowed to work, right? That's part of your requirement in being granted a visa. So here there were some graduate students, the cream of the crop of China. They weren't here because immigration allowed them to be here. They were here because they were going to study and then return. And then the revolution happens. The bamboo curtain, the iron curtain falls on them. There's no more money from home coming. They don't even know where their families are, and they're not allowed to work. And that created a terrible crisis for them. And so Ho Chow is one of the examples of that, of how unwelcome these Shanghai exiles and migrants were right here in the United States. And I guess I'd like to say that in my research and this gift that my mother gave me in telling me this story and spurring me on to get more information, I filed the Freedom of Information Act request to get my mother and my father's records. 2 years later, I got a packet in the mail, and in that packet, one was an FBI investigation of my father. because he was a proud and outspoken Chinese person criticizing U.S. policy. And there was also their INS records. You know, now it's ICE, but it was their immigration and naturalization records, which said that, and my parents had arrived here and became undocumented the way the vast majority of undocumented people in the United States do. They came in legally, not by running across the border. They came in legally, and they overstayed their visas. Why? Because their country, as they knew it, had disappeared. So they managed to stay under the radar for a little while, but then the INS papers that were in the FOIA that I received said, you are here illegally and you must be deported. You will be deported. Come to this hearing, come to that hearing, come to this hearing. So I saw this trail, and my father was arrested and detained for a short period of time. Then he had to go through all of the hearings. And in the end of a 2 to 3 year process of, you know, paper after paper saying that they were going to be deported, the final one said, you have 2 American-born children who are American citizens. You should be deported. You are here illegally. You have done so many bad things. However, because it would be an extremely unusual and cruel hardship on those American-born babies, we will not separate parent and child. Now, this decision was in 1955, the height of the Cold War, part of still the McCarthy period of the House Un-American Committee, you know, where anybody could be persecuted, and even then, J. Edgar Hoover and the INS said it would be extremely cruel to do that. And here today, where are we, right? You know, the inhumanity of separating children from parents. And so these were some of the things that I learned from this book in the process of it. So people don't leave on a whim. They leave only because they want to see their children grow beyond childhood. And when they go somewhere, they are not welcome anywhere. And so they search and search and search to find somewhere where they can live that might be a safe haven for them, their children, their families. And if they are allowed to be somewhere, they are actually going to be among the most grateful people that they could live somewhere and see their children attain something that they never could. And so, so these are some of the lessons that I think, you know, in looking at this Exodus or any of them, that we can learn from history, stop repeating it, and I guess one final thing is this inhumanity that is currently being inflicted across the world and in this country. It's something that scars children and people all their lives. My mother, even though it was more than 12 years ago that she revealed this and had a chance to at least, you know, show this terrible secret to the world and find out that it actually could be a source of pride, you know, for all of us, for, you know, in talking with my mom, that somewhere not long before she passed away, a year and a half ago, she looked at Leah, my spouse, and me, and she said, you know, you have computers. And my mother had no idea what a computer could do. But she said, you know, you have this thing, this computer. Do you think you could find my mother and father? And so here she was in her 80s, and this hole in her heart was still there. She still wanted to know where they were, what happened, why did they give her away? And of course it was very sad when I had to tell her, Mom, I have no idea how we could find them. But that's the kind of damage we are inflicting over and over and over again. And we can stop doing that if we look at some of these stories, and I think that was part of my goal, to humanize the nameless faces, invisible exoduses that happen, and this particular one that, there's not a single book in English, not a single dissertation about this forgotten exodus. And that's what's going to happen to every refugee flight there is, because not just my mother couldn't tell the terrible things that happened. That's what happens to everybody. Holocaust survivors had trouble. They weren't going to want to open that pain, until years later when maybe they were strong enough, or Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. History shows for them it took a generation before the grandparents could share with their grandchildren what had happened. And so, we won't hear the stories of what suffering is being inflicted today, and there's no reason to have people harbor that. So that's what I learned from this book. That's what these stories from Last Boat Out of Shanghai, I hope, will convey. And they'll show a little bit more also about just, not everybody in China is alike. Yes, there are 1.4 billion people, and how could you possibly think that Shanghainese and Cantonese people are the same? And so I just would like to end on a lighter note, which here we are in New York, which it's thriving Chinatown. And when I was growing up, as a child of this Shanghai diaspora, I knew that when my parents loaded us up in a car to go buy groceries in Chinatown, that we weren't exactly the same as the Cantonese, the Guangzhou Ren, who were here in Chinatown. That was true for Hong Kong, too, for the Northerners who invaded Hong Kong. And, the language was different, the customs were different, the food is different. Shanghai food is brown and sweet and salty, and, Cantonese food is clean and clear. And so what I learned about the culture conflicts from people in Hong Kong who were like, oh yeah, those and of course the stereotype of Shanghainese is the blowhards of China, the people who are so arrogant and braggart, and so what they said was, it's like this: a Shanghai person with a Shanghai person with $1 acts like they have $100. A Cantonese with $100 acts like they have $1. And so that is part of the root of the differences. And so there were actually a lot of Cantonese who lived in Shanghai. And so there's quite a lot of migration that happened within China itself. And so these are the kind of things that I also wanted to show. All these Chinese people are not alike and don't have the same opinions, don't speak the same language, don't politically are not all the same. And so this is also something that I hope will open up people's minds to know something about an event across the ocean, if they can find the Pacific Ocean on a map, that maybe they can find China and actually understand a period of history that led to the birth of modern China, how that happened, all of the political issues that also were in the backdrop of what led to an exodus, and that continue to affect us all today, especially as U.S. and China are big in the news. So thank you for letting me give this little introduction to the book. I hope you'll try to read it and buy it. And can I just say that I'm brand new to social media. I have avoided it for the last 12 years or whatever, and I was forced to have a website because I have this book. So helenzia.com, you can find me there, and I'm even on Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff at #HelenZiaReal. Because there were fakes. So thank you very much, and I can't wait to hear what our conversants will have to say. So.
Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our two discussants for the evening who will be in conversation with Helen. First, at the right end of the table, or my right end of the table, Laurence Coderre is an assistant professor of modern China in the Department of East Asian Studies at NYU. She received her PhD in Chinese from University of California, Berkeley in 2015. Prior to moving to NYU, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan. Coderre's work, which focuses on Chinese socialist and post-socialist cultural production, has appeared in Comparative Studies with Society and History, Journal of Material Culture, and a number of other publications. She's just completed a book manuscript entitled Newborn Socialist Things, Materiality in Maoist China, which is under review, and is now beginning a new project about the material manifestations of Third Worldism in the late Mao era. Pacharee Sudhinaraset is an assistant professor of English at NYU. Her research and teaching interests focus on women of color feminisms, utopia, visuality, and comparative racialization. Her current book project, provisionally titled Worlds on Fire, The Insurgent Imaginaries of Women of Color Utopia, explores how Asian American, African American, Chicana, and indigenous women's intellectual and cultural labors offer alternative genealogies of urban insurgency in the post-1960s period. And her work has been published in American Quarterly and The Black Scholar. And I should say for all three of our guests today, there are longer biographies in the program that you can take a look at. So we will begin with Laurence with some comments, followed by Pacharee, and then we'll open it up for conversation.
Happy New Year. So far from an interrogation, I suspect this will turn into something of a love fest. But as you could hear from Helen's presentation, she clearly cares about the broader context in which this book is coming out, and the ways in which the stories of refugees and the exodus that she's writing about sort of resonates with broader historical migrations and the experience of refugees around the world. And I think that comes through in the writing of the book as well. But I need to begin with something of a confession, which is that when Amita and Crystal were kind enough to invite me to participate in this event, I said, yeah, let me read the book first. And the reason that I did that is because one could imagine a very different book on this topic. And what I mean by that is Helen is absolutely right that there is a gap, yawning gap, abyss in the literature in terms of not even acknowledging this exodus, and you can imagine why that is, certainly from the PRC side. But as I said, you can imagine a very different telling of this story, a telling that fits really quite neatly into a Cold War framework where, right, this is an exodus. The last boat from Shanghai, out of Shanghai, is fleeing the communist takeover of the city. And so it could fit within a broader, well-worn narrative about fleeing the horrors of communism and traveling to America, where everything is great. And right, these refugees are welcomed with open arms and plaudits from the Statue of Liberty. And this is who we are as Americans, and this is why we won the Cold War, right? This is not the book that Helen would write, I don't think, and certainly not the book that she has written here. And I think that is something to be thankful to her for, in sort of putting down the marker of how this exodus, this period of time, will be dealt with from here on out. So that's a particularly important contribution, I think. In particular, I want to highlight the importance of the structure of the work. I think it makes a tremendous difference insofar as even though she's articulating or discussing a essentially singular migration out of Shanghai, and all of her characters end up in a restaurant in Midtown. Right, so there is a kind of arc from the French concession in 1937 to Midtown Manhattan in the early aughts. But within that, because she alternates and flits between these different characters and their stories, what we get actually is a tremendously variegated and deftly told multiplicity of experiences within that overarching frame and trajectory. And to me, that's tremendously important. It brings to the fore the refugee experience. The different people in Helen's book are fleeing for different reasons. They have different political allegiances, or lack thereof. And yet they all get out, and through various circumstances, end up in New York. And so that multiplicity is important. And for that reason, to me, the kind of overarching theme of the book is articulated by an unexpected, or comes from an unexpected source, which is, forgive me, a Hanjian, a traitor to the Chinese race, so-called, Cici Pan, Panda, who's Betty's father, who collaborated, was a puppet police commissioner during the war with Japan. So someone who would be sort of knee-jerk vilified, possibly for good reason. But he says to his son, what I assume is the last time they meet, that, quote, "In times of war, there are no good choices. Sometimes one can only choose what is less bad." Now, on the one hand, we can read that as a kind of effort to, I don't know, shirk responsibility for actions. But on the other hand, it's a statement that's consonant with all of the decisions that the characters in the book are faced with. And I think it speaks to Helen's compassion, I guess, as a writer, to be able to bring that to us as a group of readers. the last thing I will say, I'm going to be an academic for a second. But Michael Andre Bernstein has written about the difficulties of writing apocalyptic history. So in his case, he's interested in representations of the Holocaust, the Shoah. And he has written about the importance of avoiding what he calls backshadowing, which is a kind of retrospective foreshadowing. So you write about people knowing that if they stay in Germany, they're going to die in the Holocaust, or knowing that if they stay in Shanghai, they're going to be subject to the anti-rightist campaign. But of course, the people did not know that at the time. And so we collectively, when we're writing about these things, have to avoid judging people for making choices without knowing what was going to happen. And that's something that Helen, through her multiplicity of stories, does, I think, very well. And something that we should keep in mind in thinking about the kinds of decisions that refugees currently are faced with. We don't know the future, neither do they, right? And neither did these characters. Thank you.
So I first wanted to thank Crystal for inviting me to be here, and then thank you, Amita, for your labor in organizing the event today. I'm so happy and honored to be here with Helen and Laurence to celebrate, not interrogate, Helen Zia's new book, The Last Boat Out of Shanghai. The Last Boat Out of Shanghai is far-reaching, ambitious, and beautiful rendering of a multiplicity of stories told through four main characters, Bing, Ho, Benny, and Anuo. Spanning the years from 1937 to 1957, this book is about many things. It's about loss, it's about Shanghai, revolution, war, family, empire, World War II, the hot and cold Cold War, invasion, and the difficult life under Japanese occupation, Chinese nationalism, Chinese communism, and the Cultural Revolution. Perhaps most importantly, though, the book is about survival. Over and over again, Bing, Ho, Benny, and Anuo, along with their family, acquaintances, and friends, face abandonment by one's family and country, the destruction of their home and city, the death of family and friends, and the demand to continually remake their lives in unknown places. Yet they survive. So I'd like to talk about how The Last Boat Out of Shanghai allows us to think about survival. Survival in this book becomes about movement and migration. Helen prefaces the book with an excerpt from a 1949 Chinese literary magazine. Can we pull that up, Amita? So this is the quote that her book opens up with, and I'll read it. So, running away is one of our nation's characteristics. We are very good at it. The best strategy for getting out of a bad situation is to run away. It may be the only way you can save yourself. If you don't follow this rule, you end up suffering. The two characters, Tao Nan, mean running away from difficulty. When transposed, it is Nan Tao and means difficult to run away. Looking back at those who try to run away by plane or train or ship, Many ended up getting killed in accidents. It was indeed difficult for them to run away. At different points in their lives, all four characters are Taonan, running to escape from the dangers of war. In this period, Helen tells us, thousands of Chinese dispersed to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, Vietnam, South America, Africa, and India. Running away here is not a cowardly act, but is about surviving and living in the face of danger. This meant running away from the special bombs Japan rained down on the Chinese that contained fleas infected with bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, and other deadly germs that proliferated disease and epidemics. It meant getting out of the way of the Japanese troops who were given free rein to rape, torture, disembowel, and kill an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese men, women, and children. It meant running away from martial law, hyperinflation, an unstable economy, famine, the extreme hunger and poverty, and political uncertainties under the regimes of Chiang Kai-shek and Chairman Mao. It meant figuring out how to survive the racism and the constant threat of deportation in the US during a time when all Chinese in America were viewed as enemy infiltrators under McCarthyism. In many ways, this book instructs us on how to learn how to survive from people who are very good at running away. Anuo's mother knew how to move in and out of Shanghai to other cities in China through circuitous routes that took them through Yunnan and Guangxi and Hong Kong and Indochina. The people in the book were experts in immigration law, not only the laws of China, but the laws of other countries as well. When having to make difficult decisions about where to go, they knew that Australia's White Australia policy was aimed at excluding people of non-European origin, especially Asians and primarily Chinese and Pacific Islanders from immigration to Australia. They knew that the US had a quota system under the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, which expansively prohibited migration from Asia. Then there was the Immigration Act of 1924, which introduced a quota system for the entire Eastern Hemisphere. These two xenophobic exclusion laws encapsulated a period of almost complete exclusion of Asian migration to the US. However, Ho Anuo, Bing, and her elder sister, Betty, who sounds fabulous, were able to figure out how to thwart these white supremacist laws, enter, and stay in the US to reestablish their lives. So as an English teacher who studies, teaches, and thinks a great deal about writing, I'd be remiss to not talk about the way the book is written, which also sheds light on another way the text helps us think about survival. By grounding this historical period through four figures who meet and move out of many other people's lives, we get an intersecting story that is dispersed and non-singular, as Laurence was saying. Helen interweaves Ho, Benny, Bing, and Anuo's stories in such a way that gives multiple perspectives on key historical moments. The non-singularity of the story emphasizes the effects of these historical events, not just as events evacuated of actors and subjects, but as shaping ethnic, gendered, and socioeconomic conditions and material life that reverberates into our present moment. Survival for the Chinese diaspora and refugees in this context depends on the networks, relationships, and ties to one another. Ho was able to survive in the US as a grad student because his family, though struggling, sends him money from China. And when Ho was rendered homeless because his family can no longer afford to send him money and his student visa prohibits him from working, the friends that he meets on the boat over to the US provides him with a place to stay. Chinese communities exchange knowledge about the lay of the land, the globe, the law, and policy to strategize for their future. Helen's collective storytelling practice emphasizes the importance of collaborative work for an expansive critique of nationalist state laws for survival. I want to end by thanking Helen for giving me a sense of the historicity of my own family and the domestic and multinational network that my family has maintained in order to survive. My family is not from Shanghai, but my paternal grandparents are Tachu and escaped to Thailand from southern China right before the communist takeover. My maternal grandparents migrated from Hainan to Thailand for work in the early 1900s. Over the years, I've asked my parents why our family is so spread out across the US, China, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. And they used to respond with, oh, they escaped, it doesn't matter, it's unimportant, just make something up. Which is what they told me today when I told them I was going to do this talk. They said, just make it up. So in their old age, though, and now that they're retired and have some time, they've become more willing to talk story. Perhaps they realize that the people who can tell us these stories will soon be gone. More than ever, we need storytellers like Helen to not only give us a sense of where we come from, but to also record and remind us of the deep ancestral knowledge we already have and must access for survival.
Well, can I just say how overwhelming it is to hear these two scholars talk about my work and make it sound so smart, and that I was probably not conscious of any of this as I was writing it. So it's like an out-of-body experience, actually, truly, to sit here and to hear Laurence and Pacharee talk about my book in such really deep and expansive and intellectual ways, when for much of my time in these past 12 years, it's like, can I crank out another 1,000 words today? What will that be like? Please, can I? And then to have it, come together in a way. So, I'm very grateful to both of you for, you've given me another way to look at what I wrote. So thank you.
And the political analysis that the two scholars provided was really important of that this was a mark against the PRC, that millions of people fled the communist takeover. They were not just fleeing poverty, they were fleeing poverty and the communist takeover, or the liberation, the revolution. My family was not poor. They came on with the power of my grandfather's chop. My mother brought 4 sets of gorgeous dishes, furs, everything. They arrived penniless. So the analysis of why we have no information about this particular exodus is very, very interesting. The terminology used of backshadowing, I think, is very, very interesting, and makes, I think you ought to write a little thing that'll go on her book review.
I think history, unfortunately, often focuses on the people who can control the writing of history, and many, these millions of people, like the millions of people anywhere, who have no input into the writing of history books or controlling the media or whatever. We are talking about people who fled as refugees, and also they were the millions of Chinese. There are actually many books about the expats and the foreigners who fled China at that time. There are none that I could find about the many, many more Chinese who fled. So that's one thing. They were not in control of being able to tell their stories. The other thing is just how much chaos there was at the time. There really weren't records kept, or if they were, the losing regime burned as much as they could when they left, threw it in the river, whatever they could to destroy those records. Some are still around. And then, of course, the People's Republic had really no interest in preserving any of the stories of the people who fled. And you have to know that at the time that they inherited this society in chaos, Their greatest concern was to control the economy, to control inflation. How are they going to feed people? What are they going to do with these millions of displaced and homeless people? And so they had a pretty tough, government to try to create. And of course, they were creating a government at the time. So for all those reasons, these stories were hard to find at the time. And then it was China. China currently has no interest. There are no books in China about this. So there are no books in English. There are about 3 books, or 4 maybe, in Taiwan. But it only tracks, and they're in Chinese, but they track the exodus to Taiwan, not the larger, world of the diaspora. So those are my thoughts about why it's missing.
Yeah, no, I would echo that. I mean, the PRC has no interest in promoting sort of alternative national history. That's not like we were welcomed with open arms. So there's that. Taiwan is under martial law until 87. So there's a tremendous disincentive to talk about the people who ended up in Taiwan, the mainlanders who end up in Taiwan, from any kind of perspective that's not, that highlights all the social problems that resulted from an influx of, a huge influx of population. And you have all this social strife between Waishengren and Benchogen. So there's no sort of incentive to open up that wound. The Brits in Hong Kong are just sticking their ears in their fingers and going, la, 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 because, they're stuck between China and Taiwan. There's no sort of interest in even acknowledging the refugee crisis. Although you do get sort of the Wong Kar-wai treatment of like nostalgic, old-timey Shanghai in Hong Kong, but that's not exactly the same thing. And then here in the US, how many Asian American stories are being told? Not many, right? And certainly not those of refugees until lately, until now. So
I was just reminded so much of The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, the story of the Great Migration, and this being sort of our version of that. And I'm really excited to read it. I was wondering, Helen, if you could talk about the interviews, and in particular, language, and if they were in English or Chinese, and if in English reflecting on them not being in Chinese, and if in Chinese reflecting on then translation and sort of memory studies and what language we remember things in, particularly traumatic things or journeys. But if you could just reflect on the interview process in general.
Have you been to Shanghai lately, and is there any sense maybe of a newer generation interested in their parents or grandparents, or interested in the history of Shanghai? My last travelings to China seemed for a culture that is so immersed in its past and in its traditions and rituals. History is not really well regarded, and old things are not as revered as we might think they are. So I'm interested in if you've been, when you were last in Shanghai, and what you found there in terms of people interested in this subject.
question about, let me go to the language question too. So I, all along, I have to say, considered myself to be an imperfect person to, if I had to pick somebody to tell this story, to do this research, it would have been somebody who was fluent in Chinese, who could read Chinese, who could speak Shanghainese as well as Mandarin. And I did go through a time, because I did know about this last boat thing, and I was curious about it. And I actually spoke to various professor friends I had, people who were graduate students, and said, can you find somebody, because we have a limited amount of time to capture these stories. And my thought is that because Shanghai people have that reputation that they have, that it was not really a sort of popular thing to like, oh, let's go interview all these blowhard people. And part of my task and mission was to, I just knew you can't label everybody that way, and so it was to find a diversity of people who had come from Shanghai as well. But so at a certain point, and hearing my mother's story, I just knew the time is ticking away, and even though I am not the person I would have chosen to do this, I did start it. And the reason I don't speak Chinese, by the way, is because during the Cold War, my father said to my mother, don't speak Chinese to the children. They will be discriminated against if they do speak. So that was a decision I regret every day and wish my father had not said that to my mom, but I did study a little Chinese, in college. And so that brought me to being at a 3-year-old level of speaking Chinese, Mandarin. And so I can kind of get around like a 3-year-old would in China. And when I did my Fulbright, I doubled that, and living in China for 6 months, I became about a 6-year-old level. But it's not enough to do an interview. And so I did find some help while I was in China, translation help that a wonderful journalist graduate named Emily Shushuan, who came with me to different interviews. While I did archival research on the English language stuff, she was looking at Shunbao, the major Shanghai newspaper in Chinese, and so she was doing some of the translation. But as your question about translation and how does that go, implies, things do get lost in translation. And it's very clear that when you can interview somebody in a common language, you get a lot of emotion, you get a lot of nuance, which you cannot capture in a translation. And so the translated interviews were not as good. None of my characters were translated. Because Shanghai was such an international city, people did speak many different languages, and many of the people knew a little bit of English maybe when they got here, and then my 4 characters ended up in the United States. So their English facility was okay. I wouldn't say it was great, but it was well enough for me, good enough for me to be able to interview them and really draw their stories out. And every one of them, so 100 people, not all of them are equal in terms of what their recollections are, how much reflection they have on the incredible, dramatic things that happened to them in their lives. And so part of it was searching for that, looking for the diversity among the 4, that they reflected different political, economic, gender kind of experiences. And you asked about age. I interviewed people from about who, at the time I interviewed them, were around 70, and if they were 70 when I interviewed them, they were about 10 or 12 when the exodus happened. And as a lot of things like the history of the internment shows, if you were 10 or 12 and you were in an internment camp, your experience, most people say, well, actually, I had a good time. I was a kid, in like a big camp. But the experience of the adults is a whole different matter. And so the 80-year-olds I interviewed would have been around their early adulthood, 19, 20, 21. And the 90-year-olds I interviewed, I discovered pretty quickly their stories were not so reliable. Their memories might have been good about certain incidences, but then if you wanted to get a longer narrative from them or a reflection of what happened, it could spin off in any direction. And then that made me wonder, how much I could rely on even the things that were sharpest in their memories. So, those were all factors in my deciding who to choose, and some of them who weren't really reflective, like Ho Chow himself, the graduate student who ended up in New York and was at NYU. He was the first mechanical engineering graduate student at NYU. He was an engineer. He was not a terribly emotional person. And I don't mean to stereotype. I'm sure there are STEM people who are emotional and share a lot. But in his case, what he did do was he was an incredible record keeper and archivist. He had a journal that he kept, and letters. He had every piece of correspondence he had with his family while he was here, and they were in China or Taiwan or trying to flee. And their observations of what was happening in China at the time of the collapse of the government, and then in trying to save themselves, was amazing. And all of that he had recorded, he had scanned, he had organized, he had labeled, and they were all in Chinese. And so in terms of language, I had them all translated. And then I could just see what kind of just incredibly graphic descriptions they gave, that the fact that he had these letters were pretty amazing. And so then, Tomio, to your question about the Japanese American incarceration, and I'm sorry, could you repeat?
It was just an observation on my part, but mostly your recent experiences in Shanghai.
Yes.
What's happening there with this?
In maintaining the history.
Memory, yeah.
Right. So the question about in Shanghai today, what is the recognition of wanting to know history, whether it's this history or any other? And I would certainly defer to Laurence about this, but my observation is, we are talking about a totalitarian government, and history is highly regulated. And I would say that even this, not technically a totalitarian government, and it's not, it's a democracy, but there really are ways that books get chosen, stories get told, textbooks get chosen. And we know that there's a master narrative in China, there's a master narrative in the US, and every country has that what they're trying to propagate. And China, their history does not include this, and probably won't. My subtitle is The Epic Story of the Chinese Who Fled Mao's Revolution. Now, I am planning to go to Shanghai and to Beijing. There are literary festivals. The book is in English, which is to my advantage because the government really doesn't care so much what the mass of people can't read. But I do find that among Chinese nationals who are in the United States, for example, at the last few book events I've had, and perhaps there are some here, who are here as students or somehow are in the United States, they are very eager to know these histories. Mm-hmm. And they say, I never knew this in China. And, and I'm not sure what's going to happen when they go back and they're sharing a history that it is not really part of the accepted version of what history is. But there is a great hunger to know what these stories are. And so I do think that's true. And when I am in Shanghai and actually in Beijing, there are NGOs there, and actually these are primarily expat organized NGOs about heritage, Shanghai history, Shanghai heritage. There's a number of groups, but they're not exclusively expat. They, local people, Chinese nationals are welcome to participate in those too, and they do. And so that's who I'll be speaking with about this book. But I do want to say, if you all get an email that says, please help Helen, she's in jail and she's in China and needs money, do not delete it, because it might be true.
Thank you so much, Helen, for this wonderful book and this wonderful discussion, and also to Laurence and Pacharee.
If I may, I would really just want to thank Laurence and also Pacharee for their incredible comments, to thank Crystal and especially Amita Magnanini, and I'm sorry if I said that wrong, and the APA Institute for hosting this. You given me an incredible gift to have this, so thank you, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you.